Chaos Media.
Will you say something, Steeven?
The following episode will contain the names of people and places set in the fictional world of the Hyborian Age. Furthermore, if I am unable to find these names spoken aloud on YouTube or in an audiobook, they are names that I will certainly pronounce incorrectly in almost every single instance. Listener discretion is advised.
Between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Ares, there was an age undreamed of, when shining kingdoms lay spread across the world. Hither came Conan, the Cimmerian, sword in hand. It is I, his chronicler, who knows well his saga. Now let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
Well, hey everybody, looks like we got us a new episode of Hither Came Conan. I'm Steeven, and I'll be your host for this little foray into the world of the titular barbarian. And yeah, I did say that I was going to give you a month before I released this one, but darn it, I was just way too excited not to get this one done and get it out there for you. So yeah, maybe these will come out every 2 weeks, or maybe I'll just play it by ear. We'll see. For those of you just joining us, because after all, every episode is somebody's first episode, this is a show where I read one of Robert E. Howard's original Conan stories. Then I try and find the various comic book adaptations, read those as well, and then talk about them. Last episode, we looked at The Frost Giant's Daughter, which, though it wasn't published first, it did feature Conan's earliest adventure. So this time, we're going to look at The Phoenix on the Sword, which features a Conan much later in life. And in fact, he is the King of Aquilonia. It was first published in Weird Tales magazine in December of 1932. And it's actually the very first Conan story to be published. It may have not been the first Conan story that Robert E. Howard wrote, but it was definitely the first one that was published. And it's actually a rewrite of a rejected Cole story called By This Axe I Rule. So he'd written this story for Cole. You may recognize him from the Marvel Comics, Cole the Conqueror. They even made a movie that wasn't very good and had Kevin Sorbo in the role. And in fact, the movie was loosely based on This Axe I Rule. The story I've never read, the Cole story, though I did find an ebook out on the Kindle that has a lot of the Robert E. Howard Cole stories, and this is included. I haven't picked it up yet, but I do plan on it. So let me give you a synopsis of the story, the original story, the Robert E. Howard story, and then we'll talk about the adaptations and which ones I liked best, and talk a bit more about the story and all that good stuff. So this synopsis originally comes from Wikipedia, though I rewrote it quite heavily, so it would make a little bit more sense. The synopsis that was out there wasn't great. I mean, it wasn't bad. It wasn't great. It didn't really follow the order in which things happened in the story. And not that I think I did any better, but let me just give you the synopsis.
Into the boat!
As the story opens, we meet a group of men. They are traitors to the crown of Aquilonia. Among them are Grommel, the commander of Aquilonia's Black Legion, and Ronaldo, a poet and minstrel. The men have gathered to plot the murder of the king, a red-handed barbarian from the north named Conan.
Oh, hi, Conan. How are you?
He is a Cimmerian who took the crown after strangling the old king, Numidides. Now, Numidides was a tyrant who had been hated by his people, but memories are short, and it isn't long, thanks to Ronaldo and his songs, that the Aquilonians, who originally welcomed Conan as their liberator, have turned against him due to his foreign Cimmerian blood. The men have hired a southern outlaw and once Count of Aquilonia, Ascalante, to help and plan this little rebellion. And Ascalante has brought with him his slave, Thoth-Amon, who was at one time a very powerful wizard from Stygia. The plan, once the barbarian king has been slain, is to hand the crown over to one of royal blood. In this case, Dion, the Baron of Attalus. What the men don't know, however, is that Ascalante plans to take the crown for himself. Once the meeting has ended and the traitors have disbanded to wait until the moment is right to strike, Ascalante sends Thoth-Amon to watch over Dion, whom Ascalante considers a fool and a coward. Thoth-Amon, once alone with Dion, warns the Count of Ascalante's plans to murder Dion and take the crown once Conan is gone. The slave tells Dion that he had once been a powerful sorcerer. He was feared and hated by the other Stygian sorcerers because he could summon demons to do his bidding thanks to a mystical ring, a ring that had been stolen from him. Since then, he was forced to flee Stygia to stay alive and was eventually captured and enslaved by Ascalante. Furthermore, if Thoth-Amon were to murder Ascalante, something he desperately wants to do, plans would be put into motion that would reveal Thoth-Amon's identity and location to the dark sorcerers of Stygia, who wouldn't delay in finding and killing Thoth-Amon.
It's bad luck to kill a wizard.
His story causes Dion, who, wasn't really listening, to remember that he had a good luck charm, a ring that he was sold by a Shemite who claimed to have stolen it from a southern wizard. Sure enough, it is Thoth-Amon's long-lost ring. The sorcerer turned slave seizes the ring, kills Dion, and then wastes no time in using its power to call up a demon. The creature, its outline not unlike that of a gigantic baboon, though no such baboon ever walked the earth, is then sent forth to kill Ascalante and all who are with him. Meanwhile, Conan dreams of meeting the long-dead sage Epimetheus, who warns Conan of the evil that has been loosed in Aquilonia by a disciple of the evil god Set. And so he carves the symbol of a phoenix onto Conan's sword so that Conan can use it to defeat the evil. Conan wakes in his chamber to find that he's clutching the sword and discovers the phoenix on the blade. Before he can think about the dream that was not a dream, however, he hears furtive movement outside his bedchamber, and being a seasoned warrior, begins to pull on his armor. The traitors then burst into Conan's chamber to find, quote, not a naked man roused, dazed, and unarmed out of sleep to be butchered like a sheep, but a barbarian wide awake and at bay, partly armored, with his long sword in hand. The battle begins, and Conan brings his sword down upon the helmeted head of Grommel, killing the man, but shattering his sword blade in the process. Conan then snatches an ancient axe from off the wall and succeeds in killing many of his assailants. The king, however, is wounded and is about to fall under the knife of Ascalante when the demon arrives, killing Ascalante. Conan attacks, but his axe merely glances off of the beast's head, not even scratching it. It's as they grapple that Conan reaches out in desperation and finds the broken sword. He stabs the creature with it, and the demon dies. So this is not a very long tale, and while I haven't read many of the Robert E. Howard Conan stories at this point, maybe 5, maybe 6, this one is actually my favorite so far. It's got some wonderful lines in it, like, rush in and die, dogs. I was a man before I was a king, which is something he says to the men when they burst through his door. Because as they come through his door, like the synopsis said, they expected to find him kind of, waking up and, what's going on, guys? What's all the noise? But instead, they find him standing there with a sword in hand. Some of his armor is on, and he's ready to throw down. And that's when he says, rush in and die, dogs. I was a man before I was a king, which I love that line. There's also another one. Poets always hate those in power. That's a funny line. But there are 2 paragraphs in this book that were my favorite by far, and I had to write them down because I loved the language, the flow, the way Robert E. Howard wrote these 2 paragraphs and the way they depict the battle within this bedchamber between Conan and this group of traitors. It goes, with his back to the wall, he faced the closing ring for a flashing instant, then leaped into the thick of them. He was no defensive fighter. Even in the teeth of overwhelming odds, he always carried the war to the enemy. Any other man would have died there, and Conan himself did not hope to survive, but he did ferociously wish to inflict as much damage as he could before he fell. His barbaric soul was ablaze, and the chants of old heroes were singing in his ears. As he sprang from the wall, his axe dropped an outlaw with a severed shoulder, and the terrible backhand returned, crushed the skull of another. Swords whined venomously about him, but death passed him by breathless margins. The Cimmerian moved in, a blur of blinding speed. He was like a tiger among baboons as he leaped, sidestepped, and spun, offering an ever-moving target, while his axe wove a shining wheel of death about him. His axe wove a shining wheel of death about him. That is just great stuff. That is great stuff.
Great stuff, huh?
A couple of things I want to point out about the story before we move on to the comic adaptations. First off, there's a minstrel and a poet involved in this plot to kill the king. His name is Ronaldo. We mentioned that in the synopsis. Conan does not want to kill Ronaldo. There's actually a moment near the beginning of the story where Conan is hanging out with, I don't remember the guy's name. He is like the captain of the guard or his right-hand man, basically. And as part of this plot, Ascalante is able to increase he escalates the confrontations that are coming from the Picts, a savage tribe from near Aquilonia. And he's also able to involve some other nation, I believe. But anyway, it's to cause Conan's right-hand man and much of the army to leave the city. And for some reason, I can't remember his name, but as this guy is getting ready to go, he's in this outside area with Conan and they're talking, and Conan's actually working on a map. They say a lot in this story that he's a barbarian and a savage, but based on what little we learn about Conan in this story, he's a pretty smart guy. He's making a frickin' map. He talks about how the maps within the palace or within the kingdom are really good at depicting Aquilonia and many of the nations to the south, but those from the north, like Cimmeria and Vanir, and I don't remember the other one off the top of my head. Anyway, they don't do a very good job of having those on the map. And you learn that it's because a lot of folks in Aquilonia just assume that everything north of Cimmeria are myth and legend. But Conan, he kind of hints that he's been there. He knows the people. He actually really likes the people. And they're all warriors like the Cimmerians, but whereas the Cimmerians are grim and dour for living in a gray, dark land, the Aesir and the Vanir are generally happy people who smile and drink and carouse and have fun. And this guy that's hanging out with Conan kind of points out, well, then you're more like them than you are your fellow Cimmerians. Every Cimmerian I've ever met has been grim and dour, and you'd never catch one of them singing a song unless it was a war chant. And we also learn that Conan is a big fan of poetry and music because the subject of Ronaldo is brought up, because Conan's kind of lamenting on the fact, he's kind of like, I've come in and I helped liberate this kingdom from this tyrant king, Numidides, or is it Numidides? I don't remember now. Come on, Steeven. Doesn't matter. And the people loved him for this, right? He was part of some force that was brought in to liberate Aquilonia and somehow found himself in the throne room. And he's the one that ended up killing the king. And so he took the crown for himself. And he's been a good king. But Ronaldo has been out there singing songs, which paints Conan in a very bad light and places the old king on a pedestal and makes him seem godlike. And so the people of Aquilonia begin to start hating Conan. And they even build, or they put up a statue of the old king in the temple to Mitra, who apparently is their god. And so Conan's basically kind of complaining about this. He's like, these people, I liberated their nation and now they're they're grumbling about me. And the guy that he's hanging with is like, well, that's because of Ronaldo. He's out there singing them songs. You should hang that dude. And Conan's like, no, I'm not going to hang him. I like him. I like his music and blah, 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 blah. Conan's into the arts. He is a warrior. He is a barbarian. He can be very savage at times, which we see near the end of the story when he literally takes out a dozen men who try to kill him, all with an old, dull, rusty battle axe that he pulls off the wall. But I just find that interesting because then when the rebels or the traitors burst into his room to try to kill him, Ronaldo is among them. And at one point, as Ronaldo and Conan are face to face and Ronaldo's got a knife and Conan tells him, I'm giving you a chance now, leave, because I really don't want to kill you. And the guy ignores him and attacks Conan. And still Conan is I think the only point during the battle where he is fighting defensively because he doesn't want to kill Ronaldo. It would make him very sad. But then Ronaldo stabs him and Conan's just like, oh, well, you're going down, buddy, and kills him. But he's not happy about it. And I really like that part of the story. I liked the way Conan is depicted here. And I find it super interesting that this is the first Conan story ever published. And I try to imagine reading this, having never met this character before. Unfortunately, that's very hard to do because Conan's been not a big part, but a small part of my life since the early 80s when I first saw Conan the Destroyer over and over and over again on HBO. And then I'm pretty sure they put it on TNT and I watched it over and over and over on TNT. I wore that movie out. That was one of my favorite movies when I was a kid. And it was a number of years before I saw Conan the Barbarian. So the Conan the Destroyer was my introduction into Conan. And then I would get the occasional Conan comic and all that. But trying to imagine being introduced to Conan in this story, it's hard to do, but it's a really interesting exercise because I try to think about what we learn about Conan in this story and try to ignore everything else that I already sort of kind of know about Conan. I think I mentioned it in the previous episode. I'm not a Conan expert. That's kind of the point of me reading through all these stories is to learn more about the character because I've always had an infatuation with the character ever since seeing Conan the Destroyer as a kid. But I don't know, I just find it super interesting because, for example, you watch Conan the Destroyer and by the end of it, it mentions that eventually Conan becomes a king. You watch Conan the Barbarian. Of course, most people watched Conan the Barbarian before Conan the Destroyer. And it too, by the end of it, mentions Conan as a king. But Conan the Barbarian, of course, tells Conan's story chronologically. We meet Conan as a child and then see him grow up and he then becomes a thief. And that's sort of how they do it in the comics as well. I mean, when you crack open the Marvel comics, the Conan Marvel comics, one of the first stories or the first story that they adapt from Robert E. Howard is the Frost Giant's daughter. And heck, that was in issue 16 of the Conan the Barbarian comic. And I think it actually appeared, I don't remember now because I'm sure I talked about it in the last episode. It originally appeared in the black and white Conan magazine that Marvel was publishing, Savage Sword of Conan, or I think there were two different ones at some point. But when these comic book companies, both of them, when they started their runs on Conan, and they chose the first Robert E. Howard story to adapt, it was the Frost Giant's daughter, because that is the earliest tale about Conan. It's Conan at, 18, 19 years old, probably. And that's the way I grew up with Conan, that his stories were always told linear. They started when he was just coming out of Cimmeria and he went north and fought with the Aesir against the Vanir and killed the frost giants and all that. And then eventually you would start getting the Conan the King or King Conan comics. And so you knew that eventually he would become king. But knowing now that the very first Conan story ever published is him as a king, and then pretty much everything else since then is all prequel material ultimately, because I'm not 100% sure, but from what I understand, the Phoenix on the Sword, as far as the stories that Robert E. Howard wrote, The Phoenix on the Sword is the final Conan story as far as if you're looking at Conan's life in a linear fashion. So I don't know. I find that incredibly interesting. It blew my frickin' mind when I learned that. Hither Came Conan will return after these messages. And now back to Hither Came Conan. So there are two comic book adaptations to this story. First one was from Marvel Comics. It was one issue, Conan the Barbarian Annual #2 from June 22nd of 1976. It had a cover price of 50 cents. It was written by Roy Thomas, pencils by John Buscema, the inks by Young Montano, and the letters by James R. Novak. This adaptation is as loyal to the original story as it can be for a book that's about 48 pages of comic. Now, again, the actual story isn't that long. So putting it into 48 pages of a comic isn't that big of a stretch. They didn't leave a lot out. So it is very loyal to the original story. Now, I read this through the Conan the Barbarian Epic Collection, the original Marvel years of Once and Future Kings, which collects issues 60 through 71 and annuals 2 and 3 of the Conan the Barbarian comic. And it was published by Marvel Comics in March of 2022. The second adaptation is from Dark Horse. It was a 4-issue limited series, which ran from January 25th to April 25th of 2012. Each issue carried a cover price of $3.50. It was written by Timothy Truman. The art was by Tomas Giarello, the colorist Jose Villarrubia, and featured covers by Andrew Robinson. This is probably the more loyal to the original story adaptation, if only because they were able to fit pretty much everything in. I don't know that there's a lot that they left out since they were able to do it in 4 issues. And the story itself is 5 chapters. And that's kind of the four issues kind of, I think they combined 2 of the chapters into one of the issues. But because of that, I think the Dark Horse version read a lot better because it did feel like you were reading the various chapters, just like with the book or the story. I mean, now this was published, or at least I read this through another epic collection from Marvel. It's King Conan Chronicles Epic Collection, Phantoms and Phoenixes. This collects a bunch of the Dark Horse stories. Conan and the Midnight God, 1 through 5 from 2007. King Conan, the Scarlet Citadel, 1 through 4 from 2011. King Conan, the Phoenix on the Sword from 2012. Conan, the Phantoms of the Black Coast, 1 through 5 from 2012. And then materials from the Age of Conan, Hyborian Adventures. This was published by Marvel Comics in September of 2022. Now, before I get into which one I liked best, I will say that I bought these digitally. Anytime there was an Epic Collection sale on Comixology before Amazon, it was after Amazon bought them, but before Amazoned Comixology, they would do these Epic Collection sales every once in a while. And every time they would, I would pick up some Conan Epic Collections. And I believe I have them all now. And I'm really glad because now that Marvel no longer owns the license, I don't know who does. I don't know who's going to publish Conan stories next, or if anybody is, other than Ablaze, and they do the Conan stories under the title The Cimmerian. But now that Marvel no longer owns the license, you can't seem to find the digital versions of these books. You can still find the physical versions because there is, of course, a surplus of those. But with digital, once the publisher no longer has the license to sell those books, they just shut that off. So I'm glad I picked those up when I did. I remember thinking, oh my God, how many of these are there? And these are going to keep me busy for years and years and years. Why should I buy this now? Like, one of the last ones. Why should I buy this now when I have 7 of them that I haven't even read yet? And I'm really glad I made that decision because, they were like $4 each for these giant Epic collections. Granted, they're digital, but that's how some of those sales on Comixology were. All right. So Of the two adaptations, the Dark Horse one is my favorite, mainly because it was the closest to the original story, which again is one of my is probably my single favorite of the Robert E. Howard stories so far. Again, I haven't read them all, maybe 5 or 6. But the one thing they do change in the Dark Horse version is there's this framing device throughout the 4 issues where Conan or King Conan, it's a much, much older Conan who has long gray hair and a long gray beard, but he's still very fit. He's like an old man you don't want to mess with. But he's telling the story of the Phoenix on the sword. He's relating that tale to a guy named Pramus, who is a scribe who has made these appointments with Conan to, I guess, record his life. And this is where Conan is telling him one of those stories. Now, my only nitpick, really, because both of these adaptations were very well done. You know, the Marvel one was from 1976. That's always something you need to keep in mind when you're reading the Marvel adaptations. They're 70s comics. They're a bit corny. They look a certain way. And when it came to the look of the various characters, such as Ascalante and Thoth-Amon, they look completely different than the ones depicted in the Dark Horse versions. But the Dark Horse versions were more true to what little description you were given about these characters in the original story, which is another reason why the Dark Horse version is my favorite of the two. And then the one, of course, that puts it over the top is the art by Tomás Giorello. At first, I was not a big fan of the art, especially with the coloring. There's a lot of scenes there at the beginning where the characters are colored with the exact same color scheme as the backgrounds, and they tend to kind of fade into the background. But the more I read, there are just some wonderful, wonderful scenes and artwork and panels in these 4 issues. There's in the original story, when Conan meets Epimetheus, it's basically a dream that's not a dream. He's asleep and he's mystically taken to this place where Epimetheus 1,500 years ago was buried, where his tomb is. And it's really a very short scene. It's maybe 2 paragraphs. It's really short. But the way they do it in the Dark Horse version, there's like a moment in the scene where Epimetheus is basically telling Conan that he has been the foe of the evil god Set for his entire life, and his life lasted 3 times that of a normal person. And as he's talking about that, there's just these wonderful depictions of him battling this serpent god, and one is him wrestling with this giant snake, and it is beautiful. And then, of course, the battle with Conan and the traitors, the assassins, is just some great stuff to look at. Very violent, very bloody. You don't see that in the Marvel adaptation because they had to adhere to the Comics Code Authority at the time. But the Dark Horse adaptation in 2012, they didn't have to worry about all that crap. So it's pretty darn bloody. But my only nitpick is when Thoth-Amon calls forth this demon in the story. The Robert E. Howard story specifically mentions that Thoth-Amon never faces the demon. He keeps his back to him the entire time. And when he calls forth this demon, he actually pulls Ascalante's sandal, one of his sandals from his robes. He has had a moment at some point in the past where he stole a discarded sandal from Ascalante and kept it in hopes that he could use it in some fashion against Ascalante. And boy, that sure paid off in this story. But when he calls the demon, he keeps his back to it. Like he won't face it. He doesn't want to look at it. And while it's not stated at all in the story, the implication that I get is that either he doesn't want to face such a horror, or possibly, if you really want to read a lot into it, maybe there is a thing mystically where if the demon makes eye contact with you, that the demon can wrest itself from your grasp and turn on you. But they specifically state that he keeps his back to this baboon-like demon, while in both of the adaptations, he he faces it and looks it in the eyes and hands it the sandal and all this stuff. But the only other thing now that I'm thinking about it, when he sends the demon off, he gives it the sandal and he's like, this belongs to Ascalante. I want you to find him and kill him and all who are with him. In both of the adaptations, when he says, and all that are with him, they treat it as if it is kind of an afterthought. I'm gonna pull up the story right now, the original story, because you can get it on Wikisource. It's available to read for free on Wikisource. I'll try to remember to put the note or to put the link in the show notes. But it's chapter 3 where Thoth-Amon calls forth the demon. There was a movement in the air about him, such a swirl as is made in water when some creature rises to the surface. A nameless, freezing wind blew on him briefly, as if from an open door. Thoth felt a presence at his back, but he did not look about. He kept his eyes fixed on the moonlit space of marble, on which a tenuous shadow hovered. As he continued his whispered incantations, the shadow grew in size and clarity until it stood out distinct and horrific. Its outline was not unlike that of a giant baboon, but no such baboon ever walked the earth, not even in Stygia. Still, Thoth did not look, but drawing from his girdle a sandal of his master, always carried in the dim hope that he might be able to put it to such use, he cast it behind him. "Know it well, slave of the ring," he exclaimed. "Find him who wore it and destroy him. Look into his eyes and blast his soul before you tear out his throat. Kill him, aye!" in a blind burst of passion. "And all with him." And yeah, I'm not going to read the last two paragraphs, but then the demon sets off to go find and kill Ascalante. But in the 2 comic book adaptations, that part, the "and all with him," is treated almost as an afterthought. Like he tells the creature, go kill him, look into his eyes, blast his soul. Before you tear out his throat, kill him. The creature runs away to go do it. And as it's running, he's like, oh yeah, and all with him. Like as if to say that, the fact that Conan then has to battle this demon is only through the whim of Thoth-Amon. Had he not decided to say that at the last minute, then the demon would have killed Ascalante and then left. And Conan wouldn't have to have fought him. And I don't know. I thought that was, it's not that I don't like that choice. I just find it weird that both adaptations did that. Beyond that, the last thing I want to talk about is Thoth-Amon himself, whom for the longest time I always read that as Thoth-Amon. I guess I ignored that H there in the first part of his name. But this is, of course, Thoth-Amon's first appearance, obviously, considering that it's the first Conan story published. And while Robert E. Howard apparently, based on what I could find, he apparently mentions the wizard in other stories. In Robert E. Howard's stories, he and Conan never actually meet. And that's what's kind of neat about this story as well. I mean, in the end, the ultimate bad guy, the ultimate big bad is Thoth-Amon. He's not trying to kill Conan. That's not the point of what he's trying to do. He's just getting his power back. I think I put on Twitter when I posted one of the covers during my 500 comic goal hashtag thing, I said for that issue, Thoth-Amon gets his groove back. And that's kind of the point of his story. I mean, in the end, this isn't just Conan's story. It's almost more Thoth-Amon's story than Conan's, because he started out as a powerful wizard before he appears in this story. Now he's a slave, and he's able to get his power back and kill his master, and then apparently escapes into the night. But the fact that he and Conan never meet really isn't that big of a deal if this is the only story you've ever read. But if you are more familiar, especially with the Marvel comics, then you probably know his name, because again, while he and Conan never meet in Robert E. Howard's stories, which basically means that Thoth-Amon, from what I understand, I take that as meaning he never really becomes a major character for Robert E. Howard in any of the rest of his stories. But after Robert E. Howard dies and other authors start telling Conan stories, Thoth-Amon is put into those. And he ends up becoming basically Conan's Lex Luthor, especially when it comes to the Marvel comics of the 70s and 80s, where he had no less than 37 appearances. So there's just a number of things about this story that I find just, well, I'll say it again, super interesting because I'm not a very creative person.
I'm delegating creativity to creative professionals.
But, like, wait a minute. His first story, he's a king? What the flip is that about? Oh, Thoth-Amon is this. Well, of course I know him. He's the bad guy from the comics. Wait, he never actually faces Conan? It's just really cool. I really, again, my favorite of the Robert E. Howard stories so far. I still have a number of them left to go. And that was the Phoenix on the Sword. If you have any comments you want to make, if you want to pipe in on what you thought of the story, you can shoot me an email over at stevenorelse@gmail.com. I probably will eventually create an email address specifically for Hither Came Conan, but I haven't done that yet. Same thing with a YouTube channel. I don't want to go through the effort. Oh my gosh, it's so hard to create an email address and a YouTube channel if they're not really ever going to be used. I did put, because I know that a number of my listeners of the other podcasts do use YouTube as their podcatcher. Even though it's a video service, smart genius podcasters like me will do audio versions of videos, which just means you usually take a static image. And so if you're looking at the video, you're just looking at, typically the podcast cover art. So there's no actual movement, but you can listen to the podcast that way. And in this day and age, you can pull that up on your phone, stick your headphones in and go for a jog. You don't have to watch it. That's kind of the point. And of course, the nice thing about YouTube that I wish all these other podcatchers would do is that you can, as the owner of the YouTube channel, you can take these episodes and place them into different playlists. So, for example, over on my Just Another Fanboy YouTube channel, I have like a Madman playlist. So if you want to go in and just listen to only my Madman issues or Madman episodes, you go to that playlist. So knowing that, I did put this episode on YouTube over at the Steven or Else channel. And if I find that folks are watching it or listening to it, then I probably will eventually start its own YouTube channel. But good Lord, we're only 2 episodes in. I don't want to get too deep into things and then something happens and I can't do the podcast after a few episodes. That's not my plan. I don't plan for that to happen, but shit happens, right? Anyway, that was Phoenix on the Sword. Let me know what you thought.
Everybody out!
Next up is the Scarlet Citadel, which is not one of the 5 or 6 stories I've read before. And as of the time I'm recording this, it was adapted by the Marvel Comics magazine Savage Sword of Conan in issue number 30 from April of 1978. And it was also adapted in the 4-issue miniseries King Conan the Scarlet Citadel from Dark Horse Comics that ran from February to May of 2011. And I'll add real quick that I was also lucky enough to pick up 3 of the Savage Sword of Conan omnibuses that Marvel released not that long ago when they had the license of Conan. I got those for just a few bucks each as well over on Amazon. So I got all this stuff. I'm so happy. But yeah, will the 3rd episode come out in a month? Will it come out in 2 weeks? I don't know. But get out there and start reading. The nice thing about podcasts is you're not done reading with the story and I release the episode, you don't have to listen to it right away, right? Stick it in your queue. Once you're done reading the stories, you can come back and listen to it. Or you can do like I do with a lot of other shows. I don't always read the books. I listen to the episodes and that teaches me what I need to know about the issues and the stories and all that stuff. So whatever you want to do, you're going to do. Until then, folks, my name is Steven and this has been Hither Came Conan. Talk to you later. I want to thank you for listening to this episode of Hither Came Conan. Questions and comments can be directed to feedback@hithercameconan.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can help to boost our presence online by leaving a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. I also invite you to join our subscription program, Steven or Else Beyond. And in return, you'll get episodes of Hither Came Conan along with every other podcast under the Steven or Else Media umbrella, early and ad-free. You can can subscribe to Steven or Else Beyond through Apple Podcasts, Patreon, or Substack. Check out the link in the show notes, or just go to hithercameconan.com to choose the option that's best for you. Hither Came Conan is a presentation of Steven or Else Media. For more nerdy content hosted by me, check out stevenorelse.com.
Many wars and feuds did Conan fight. Honor and fear were heaped upon his name. In time, he became a king by his own hand. This story shall also be told.
I just don't think I can move through life knowing that a guy named Steven did this to me.
How could you let this happen, Steven?
Your podcast sucks.
Enough talk.